Hey friends, it's Anna. I'm so glad you're here because I can't wait to talk with you guys about the books I read in July and share my reading journal spreads for the month. I had a really enjoyable reading month, so this should be a good wrap up. I'm starting off these reading journal spreads with a cover page for the month, which will go on the left page here. I'm cutting out some images that I printed, and I'm basically just going to create a little collage for the cover page. In general, I would say my journal has a light academia vibe, and then my plan for each monthly setup is to stick with that aesthetic, but also try to create a vibe that represents the books I read that month. So because in July I read 2 books that had these beautiful blue covers, which I will show you the actual books later in the video because they're so pretty, and I read a book titled Bluebird, I felt like I had to do a blue theme for the month. I'm using some stickers from this beautiful botanist anthology sticker book, and then I'm going to put some tea-stained paper in the middle of the page for the title. I used Elizabeth's tutorial on her channel Plant-Based Bride for how to stain the paper, so I'll link that video below if you guys want to check it out. And my reading journal is also definitely inspired by Elizabeth's style too. Some last touches I'll add to this cover page will be some washi tape. These all come from the Minimalist set from Nade. As you can see, I'm sticking with this light and airy blue palette. The cursive script washi tape I used in the top right is also from Nade, the vintage set. And all my supplies I'm using will be linked in the description box below, as always. On this right page, I'm going to create a little reading summary for the month, which will have the covers of all the books I finished and some reading stats. And then each of these books will also get their own spread in the following pages where I can go more in depth on my thoughts for each one. I print my book covers using Google Docs and a normal printer, but if you'd like a little tutorial on my process, you can find that in my 2023 reading journal setup video. I read 2 historical fiction books in July, both World War II stories, and 2 classics. You might have been able to guess that I read Pride and Prejudice from the leftmost picture on my cover page, which is the manor they used for filming Pemberley in the 2005 Pride and Prejudice film. So around these book covers, I'm adding some stats. On the top left, we have my ratings. I had 1 book each for 3 and 4 stars, and then 2 5-star reads, so a pretty good month. The other stat on top is how many total pages I read in the month, and each color in the bar represents a different book. On the bottom, I have author gender. I read 3 books, or 75% by female authors, and 1 book by a male author. In the middle bottom, I have a timeline for when the books were published, which I really wanted to include for this month since I did read 2 classics published in the 19th century. Lastly, I have a bar chart for the different genres I read, and that's my little July reading summary. Now we'll get into the specific spreads I'm creating for each book. First up, we have the 2 historical fiction reads, both of which I really enjoyed and would highly recommend to you all. Starting with My Mother's Secret, this was an incredibly short book, as you can see, and I actually almost didn't buy it because I was worried it was too short for a strong story to develop, especially since we do get 4 POVs. But this author made every word count and somehow created this beautiful story with amazingly fleshed out characters in a quarter of the space that most authors use. The book is about a mother and daughter in Nazi-occupied Poland who hid 2 Jewish families and a defecting German soldier in their house, and kept it a secret not only from their neighbors and the Nazis, but each family hiding in the house didn't know about each other either. So we get the point of view from the daughter, the fathers of the 2 families, and the German officer. I gave this book 4 stars. It probably should be 4.5, and I would love to go back and study this author's writing because I'm still blown away at how, with so few words, she managed to paint such real characters with backstories and personalities, and who I was rooting for so much. It was also just a beautifully written story in general, with lots of great messages about our human capacity for kindness and bravery and resilience. And it is based on a true story. The mother and daughter in the book were real people that did in fact save 15 Jewish people and a German soldier during the war, so that's really cool as well. On my spread for this book, I pasted in a picture of an apple tree, which was a main symbol throughout the book. I also chose 2 of my favorite quotes to write here, which are, "Love is the only thing that you get more of when you give it away," and "Her remedy was a heavy dose of optimism blended with some truth. Hope is a strategy after all." Also, I will update my annual spreads in the journal at the end of the video, so stick around for that if you want to see how I'm doing on my annual reading goals or what my setup pages for this journal look like. Next, I read Bluebird, which takes place in Berlin during the last few months of World War II and then post-war in America, kind of getting into some Cold War politics. I gave this book 5 stars. I zoomed through it because I had to know what happened next, but the story has also really stuck with me. I remember the night I finished it, I literally stayed up for hours reading through unclassed CIA documents because the historical events going on in the book were so crazy, I could hardly believe they were real. What was really unique about this book is one of the POVs we get is from a German-raised girl whose father is a pretty high-ranking Nazi, which is a perspective that isn't written about that often. I really liked what the author wrote in her author's note, and this quote kind of encompasses the whole theme of the book. She wrote, "And what would happen, I thought, if someone raised in Nazism, steeped in the trauma and guilt of the past, stepped straight into a belief system diametrically opposed to everything they had known before, where love is undeserved, unearned, and unconditional. The answer, I hope, is that they would transform." Wow, it gives me chills just reading that and thinking about the story again. I saw somewhere that this book was young adult, which really surprises me because it's probably one of the more harrowing war stories I've read. Please check out the trigger warnings before reading it because there are a few, but if you're okay with reading about those topics, I highly, highly recommend you pick up this book. Next up, we have the 2 classics I read, Pride and Prejudice and Treasure Island. I wanted to show you guys these books because they're both so beautiful. This is the Barnes & Noble Collectibles edition of Pride and Prejudice, the copy I've had since middle school, so this book is very dear to me. And we got this cloth-bound Penguin Classics edition for Treasure Island, which is so striking, I think. Whenever I buy classics, I like to have fancy editions. I'm starting with my Pride and Prejudice page on the left. If you saw my reading journal setup, you know it's one of my 2023 goals to read through all of Jane Austen's novels this year. Pride and Prejudice is one I've read countless times. It's definitely my favorite. It's the first Jane Austen book I ever read. If you don't know this story, well, first, please go read it right now. It's obviously a 5-star book in my opinion. But if you're unfamiliar with the story, it's about the Bennet sisters and their coming of age and trying to find husbands. Our main character is the outgoing and witty Elizabeth Bennet, and she has a romance with the quiet and proud Mr. Darcy. The love story between Elizabeth and Darcy is one of my favorites of all time. This is like the OG enemies to lovers, I think. I also just adore Elizabeth Bennet. I think she's such an amazing female character who is strong and intelligent, but who is also willing to be humbled and learn from her mistakes, which I really respect. This book will always be one of my favorites. I'm also a big fan of the 2005 movie adaptation because that was my first introduction to this story, so I used some images from that movie for this spread. The last book I read in July was Treasure Island. I read this with my book club, and this book was actually my husband's pick. It wasn't my favorite read ever, but I am glad I read it and did really enjoy seeing the origin of so many pirate-themed tropes. The story centers around our protagonist, Jim Hawkins, a young boy who gets wrapped up in a treasure hunt and has to deal with pirates, treachery, and of course the infamous Long John Silver along the way. The character of Long John Silver was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole book. You could never really tell which side he was on, long game or in the moment, and that made the story pretty fun. I did only give it 3 stars. I think a lot of the sailing lingo was hard to read, and of course it was written in the 1800s, so it has that older style language. I think that since I've read a lot of Jane Austen books multiple times, the language in those isn't such a barrier to me anymore, but it was my first time reading Treasure Island, and there were more than a few moments where I had to go back and reread a paragraph to understand what the heck was going on. And that does take you out of the story a little bit. But I still had a fun time reading it. Definitely a good old-fashioned, lighthearted adventure story. And of course, the quote I had to include for this book is the iconic sea shanty, "Yo ho ho and a bottle of rum." I'm really pleased with how these 2 spreads turned out in the journal. I went back to using a lot of blue, and I also love the sheet music at the bottom. This is from a really old piano book that I just had lying around. And that completes my setups for my July reads. Now I'm going to flip back to my 2023 setup pages and fill them in with the new books. If you want to see my setup for these pages, I will link that video below, and it should also be an option at the end of this video. After filling in the index, these are my reading tracker and goals pages. I've now read 27 books in 2023. I've read 2 Jane Austen books, and with Treasure Island, I'm up to 2 classics. So overall, I'm doing pretty good with all my reading goals. Next, I'm updating my reading log with my start and finish dates, number of pages, and rating for each book. I only started this journal halfway through the year and wasn't tracking all of these stats before then, so that's why some of these columns are blank. Here we have my book bracket, which I'm not going to fill in now because I'm saving the whole thing for the end of the year, and I might do a whole video just for filling in this spread. Here we have my book club spread, which I can add Treasure Island to. And now we'll do a final flip through for July. I hope you guys enjoyed these spreads and talking about books with me. Please let me know your thoughts on any of these books if you've read them, or any amazing books that you read in July. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.